My father didn't whisper it. He didn't say it privately. Either. He said it loud enough for half the auditorium to hear. The one who'll become a lawyer in this family is Daniel, not her. A few people chuckled politely, the way strangers do when they aren't sure whether something is a joke or an insult. Others nodded, glancing briefly toward the back rows where I was sitting. I kept my hands folded quietly in my lap. The stage lights washed across the large auditorium of Northeastern Law School in Boston, reflecting off hundreds of black graduation robes. Cameras flashed. Families whispered excitedly. Somewhere near the front, my father stood proudly beside my younger brother. To him, tonight was proof he had always been right. Daniel Whitmore was the future lawyer of the family. The son who would carry the Whitmore name into the legal world. Not the daughter who had once dared to suggest she wanted the same future. Not the girl who spent late nights reading courtroom transcripts instead of watching television. Certainly not the daughter he had told, more than once, that the law was too brutal for someone like me. What he didn't know was that the last time he said those words, I had already taken an oath in a courtroom. And in a few minutes, the entire room was going to learn the truth. The ceremony had already begun when I slipped quietly into the auditorium. Rows of proud parents filled the seats. Flowers, cameras, and whispered congratulations floated through the air like background music. I chose a seat near the back where no one would easily notice me. That had always been my place in the family anyway. The quiet observer. The daughter who watched while my brother received the attention. The daughter who learned early that applause in our house had been reserved for someone else. On stage, faculty members in dark academic robes sat in a neat row behind the podium. The dean of the law school stood to one side, waiting to begin the next portion of the ceremony. Near the front of the auditorium, I could see my father clearly. Robert Whitmore looked exactly the way I remembered him from childhood. Tall, perfectly dressed, confident in every movement. He was speaking with another family, gesturing toward Daniel with the kind of pride that filled the entire space around him. I couldn't hear the full conversation, but I could guess what he was saying. He had spent most of Daniel's life telling anyone who would listen that his son was destined for the law. The Whitmore legacy would continue through Daniel. The Whitmore name would remain respected in legal circles. My father had always believed in two simple truths. First, that the family name must stay connected to the legal profession. Second, that the son would carry it forward. I had learned those lessons very early. When I was 10 years old, my father told guests at a family dinner that Daniel would one day stand in a courtroom just like the great lawyers he admired. That same night, when someone asked what I wanted to become, my father smiled politely and said I would probably choose something more practical. I remember laughing along with the adults at the table. At 10 years old, I didn't yet understand that he wasn't joking. On the stage, the announcer began reading the names of the graduating students. One by one, young men and women walked across the platform to receive their diplomas. Families clapped and cheered loudly with every name. The sound echoed through the auditorium like waves. Eventually, I saw Daniel's name appear in the program booklet resting on my lap. Daniel Whitmore, even printed on the page. The name looked exactly the way my father had always imagined it. The Whitmore lawyer. The Whitmore future. For a moment, I watched my brother sitting among the graduates. He looked confident, relaxed, completely at ease with the world he had grown into. Our father had spent years building connections that helped Daniel reach this stage. Elite schools, powerful mentors, the right introductions. Everything had been carefully prepared for him. Everything except the one thing my father never imagined. That the daughter he dismissed years ago had walked a very different path. A quieter one. A lonelier one. But one that had led somewhere he never expected. As the ceremony continued, the dean of the law school stepped toward the podium to deliver his closing remarks. The room slowly grew quiet. His voice carried easily across the auditorium as he spoke about responsibility, justice, and the role lawyers play in shaping society. I listened carefully, feeling the strange calm that had settled over me since I arrived. For years I had imagined this moment differently. I thought I would feel anger or satisfaction, but what I felt instead was clarity, because the truth no longer needed to be hidden. Near the end of his speech, the dean paused and slowly looked across the audience. His eyes moved through the rows of families, scanning faces. Then something changed. His gaze stopped when it reached the back section of the auditorium, right where I was sitting. For a moment he stared, as if making sure he wasn't mistaken. And in that brief silence, I realized something important. He knew exactly who I was. To understand why that moment in the auditorium mattered so much, you have to go back 12 years. Back to a long wooden dinner table in Charleston, South Carolina. The Whitmore house had always been quiet during dinner. My father believed meals were for discipline, not conversation. The television stayed off. Phones were not allowed at the table. Everyone sat straight, spoke politely, and listened when he talked. That night, though, I had something I wanted to say. I was 21 years old, halfway through my undergraduate degree, and I had spent the previous year volunteering at the local courthouse. I had watched public defenders argue cases. I had read legal opinions late into the night. I had started to imagine a future that looked very different from the one my father expected for me. When the plates were cleared and the conversation slowed, I finally gathered the courage. "I've been thinking about applying to law school," I said. For a moment, no one reacted. My mother continued folding her napkin carefully. My younger brother Daniel stared down at his plate. My grandmother Eleanor sat quietly at the end of the table, her eyes already shifting toward my father. Then my father leaned back in his chair. At first, he laughed. Not loudly, just the kind of amused chuckle someone makes when they think they've heard a harmless joke. "You're serious?" he asked. "Yes," I said. I explained how much time I had spent at the courthouse. I told him about the classes I had taken in constitutional law and legal theory. I talked about how alive I felt when I studied cases and courtroom arguments. For the first time in my life, I was describing something I truly wanted. My father didn't let me finish. He waved one hand dismissively, the same way he used to brush away dust from his jacket. "Caroline," he said calmly, "the law is not the right path for you." The room went quiet again. I waited for him to elaborate, thinking he might be worried about tuition costs or the stress of the profession. But that wasn't his concern. "The legal world is demanding," he continued. "Competitive? Ruthless." He paused and looked toward my younger brother. "That future belongs to Daniel." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but my father kept speaking. "I've been preparing him for that career for years," he said proudly. "He'll attend the right schools. He'll meet the right people. Eventually, he'll lead the Whitmore Legal Network." Then he turned back toward me. "The one who'll become a lawyer in this family is him, not you." The words were not shouted. They were said with complete certainty, as if the matter had already been decided long ago. I remember glancing around the table. Daniel avoided my eyes. My mother looked down, her fingers tightening around her napkin. Only my grandmother met my gaze, and in her expression I saw something my father hadn't expected: disapproval. The rest of the dinner continued as if nothing unusual had happened. My father spoke about Daniel's upcoming academic programs and potential universities. Plans had already been made for private tutors and summer preparation courses. No one mentioned my law school dream again. Later that night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I sat alone in my bedroom staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. I was still trying to decide whether to feel angry or embarrassed. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. When I opened the door, my grandmother Eleanor stood in the hallway. She stepped inside without saying a word and closed the door behind her. My grandmother had spent most of her life working as a clerk in the Charleston courthouse. She understood the legal world in ways my father sometimes forgot. For a moment, she simply studied my face. Then she spoke. "Your father believes the courtroom belongs to men," she said gently. "But the law only cares about who knows the truth." She reached into the small bag she carried and placed a thick book on my desk. It was an old legal reference guide filled with handwritten notes. I used this for years at the courthouse, she said. I think you'll understand it better than anyone else in this house. I ran my fingers across the worn pages. For the first time since dinner, I felt something stronger than humiliation: hope. Over the next few months, the difference between my brother's future and mine became painfully clear. My father hired private tutors to prepare Daniel for elite universities. Consultants helped plan his academic path years in advance. Meanwhile, when I asked about help with law school applications, my father refused. You should consider something more practical, he said. By the time I turned 23, I understood something important. If I wanted to become a lawyer, I would have to do it without my family. So I left Charleston. I moved to Chicago with one suitcase, a part-time office job, and just enough savings to rent a tiny apartment. During the day, I worked as a legal assistant. At night, I took classes and studied until my eyes burned from exhaustion. Some nights, I fell asleep with textbooks still open on my desk. The loneliness of those early years was something I never fully described to anyone. No family support. No financial safety net. Just the quiet memory of my father's voice repeating the same sentence over and over. The law is Daniel's future, not yours. One evening, after a long shift at work, I returned to my apartment building and found a large envelope slipped under my door. There was no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter. The moment I saw the careful script across the page, I recognized it instantly. My grandmother, Eleanor. I sat down at the small kitchen table and began reading. The letter was short. She told me she was proud of the courage it took to leave home and pursue my dream. She wrote that sometimes the people closest to us cannot see our true path. At the bottom of the envelope was something unexpected: a check. Attached to it was a small handwritten note. For your law school application, it said. Don't tell your father. I stared at the check on my kitchen table for a long time before I finally picked it up. It wasn't a fortune. Just enough to cover application fees, textbooks, and a portion of tuition if I was careful. But to me, it felt like something much bigger. It felt like someone had finally opened a door that had been closed in my face. The next morning, I began filling out law school applications. But before I submitted them, I made one quiet decision. I shortened my last name. Instead of Caroline Whitmore, I applied as Caroline Witt. It wasn't a lie. Just a piece of the truth. Part of me didn't want my father's name following me into every interview or admissions office. Another part of me didn't want him discovering what I was doing before I had the chance to prove I could succeed. If I was going to build a future in the law, I wanted to earn it without the shadow of the Whitmore reputation. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, after another long shift answering phones at the small legal office where I worked, I found a thick envelope waiting in my mailbox. The return address belonged to a law school in Chicago. I opened it, standing right there in the hallway of my apartment building. My hands were shaking before I even finished reading the first sentence. I had been accepted. It wasn't the kind of elite institution my brother would eventually attend. There were no famous alumni or polished marble halls. But it was real. And it was mine. The next chapter of my life began quietly. During the day, I worked as a legal assistant, filing documents, preparing paperwork, and watching attorneys move through their cases with the calm confidence of people who had been trained for years. At night, I attended law school. The routine was brutal. I woke before sunrise, worked a full shift at the office, then rushed across the city to attend evening classes that often stretched late into the night. After class, I studied in small libraries or empty classrooms until the security guards started locking doors. More than once I fell asleep on the last train ride home, my backpack full of casebooks pressed against my knees. Many of my classmates had families paying their tuition. Some drove expensive cars. Others talked about internships arranged through powerful connections. I had none of that. Every tuition payment came from overtime hours and careful budgeting. Some weeks I lived almost entirely on instant noodles and coffee. But I never once considered quitting. Because every time exhaustion crept in, I remembered my father's voice at that dinner table. The law is Daniel's future, not yours. Those words became fuel. Every exam I passed felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from me. Every lecture about courtroom procedure reminded me why I had started this journey. And slowly, something else began to happen. I started to get better. In my second year of law school, I applied for an internship at the Cook County Prosecutor's Office. I filled out the application late one night after class, assuming it would be ignored like dozens of others. When I received an email inviting me for an interview, I thought it must be a mistake. The interview took place in a small office overlooking downtown Chicago. The man waiting behind the desk introduced himself as Marcus Hale. He was a senior prosecutor with a reputation for being both brilliant and brutally direct. He flipped through my resume silently for a few minutes before looking up. "You're working 2 jobs while attending law school," he said. "Yes." He studied me carefully. "Why?" It wasn't the kind of question that asked about money or ambition. He wanted something deeper. So I told him the truth. "Because someone once told me I didn't belong in this profession." Marcus Hale leaned back slightly in his chair. "And that made you want it more?" "Yes." For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he closed the folder and nodded once. "Good answer," he said. 2 days later, I received the internship. Working at the prosecutor's office changed everything. For the first time, I wasn't just studying the law. I was watching it happen. I sat quietly behind experienced prosecutors as they argued cases in real courtrooms. I listened to witnesses testify, watched juries react, and studied how judges controlled the rhythm of every trial. The courtroom felt completely different from a classroom. More intense, more real, more alive. One afternoon, during a routine hearing, Marcus leaned toward me as the judge questioned both attorneys. "Pay attention to this part," he whispered. "This is where you learn how the law actually works." The judge on the bench was an older man with a calm voice and sharp eyes. At one point, he glanced briefly toward the back of the courtroom where I was sitting beside Marcus. The look lasted only a second. But after the hearing ended, Marcus said something that caught me off guard. "You notice that—" "Notice what?" I asked. "The judge looked at you." I shrugged. "I'm just an intern." Marcus shook his head slightly. "That judge has been on the bench for 20 years, he said. "He doesn't waste attention." I frowned. "I don't understand." Marcus gathered his files and stood. "He only watches people who might sit up there one day." A week later, as I was leaving the office after another long day, Marcus called me back into his office. He handed me a sealed envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "A recommendation form," he said. "For what?" "A judicial clerkship program." I stared at the envelope. Marcus folded his arms and smiled slightly. "You're not just here to practice law." "Caroline," he said, "you're here to change the room." By the time the case file landed on my desk, I had already spent several years working as an assistant district attorney in Chicago. Most mornings followed the same routine. Coffee, court schedules, a stack of files waiting to be reviewed before hearings began. The work was steady and often repetitive. Fraud complaints, contract disputes, corporate settlements that rarely made headlines. I had learned that most legal battles were not dramatic courtroom showdowns. They were quiet wars fought through paperwork. The file that arrived that morning looked no different. A mid-sized logistics company was facing complaints from several former employees who claimed their injury settlements had been handled unfairly. Nothing unusual. Companies negotiated settlements all the time. Sometimes aggressively, sometimes unethically, but usually within the boundaries of the law. At first glance, the case appeared technical. Pages of contracts, settlement agreements, internal communications between attorneys and consultants. I began reading through the documents the way I always did, slowly, methodically, making notes along the margins. About 20 minutes in, a name caught my attention. Whitmore Strategic Legal Advisors. I paused. Whitmore was not an uncommon name. I had seen it attached to firms and businesses before. Still, something about it made me read the line again. The consulting firm had been hired by the logistics company to assist with settlement strategy after several workplace injury claims were filed. That alone wasn't suspicious. Corporate consulting firms often advised companies during negotiations. But as I kept reading, the name appeared again and again. Eventually, the connection became impossible to ignore. Whitmore Strategic Legal Advisors was my father's company. I leaned back slowly in my chair. For years, I had built a life far away from Charleston and everything connected to my family. Different city, different career, different reputation. I had spent nearly a decade making sure the name Whitmore had nothing to do with my professional life. And now it was sitting in the center of a legal investigation on my desk. For a moment, I considered walking down the hallway and asking my supervisor to reassign the case. No one in the office knew the firm belonged to my father. No one would question my request. But something inside me refused to step away. Instead, I kept reading. The consulting firm's role became clearer as the documents unfolded. Emails between company executives described strategy meetings with legal consultants who specialized in minimizing settlement payouts. There was nothing technically illegal about that. Companies hired experts to reduce liability all the time. But the details of the negotiation tactics were unsettling. The consultants advised offering injured workers immediate settlement payments before full medical evaluations could be completed. Quick agreements, lower compensation, fewer lawsuits. Technically legal, but ethically questionable. As I flipped through another set of documents, a second familiar name appeared in the correspondence. Daniel Whitmore. My brother. His name appeared as an associate consultant on several negotiation plans. That surprised me more than anything else. The last I had heard, Daniel was working for a prestigious law firm after finishing law school. Apparently, he had already begun working with my father's consulting network. The email threads showed him advising corporate representatives during several key settlement discussions. I read one message twice to make sure I understood it correctly. Daniel suggested offering what he called fast resolution incentives, small payments designed to encourage injured workers to accept settlements quickly rather than pursue legal claims. Again, not illegal, but the strategy relied heavily on pressure and timing. The goal was to close cases before victims had time to consult independent attorneys. I stared at the screen in front of me. For most of my childhood, my father had spoken about the law as if it were a noble profession. Justice, order, fairness. Yet the documents in front of me suggested something else entirely. The legal empire he built might not have been protecting justice at all. It might have been protecting corporations. I continued reading until one particular document caught my attention. It was a printed memo attached to a strategy outline. The page had been marked with a short handwritten note. Strategy approved. Daniel will handle negotiations moving forward. The handwriting was unmistakable. Robert Whitmore. My father. I set the document down slowly. The realization felt heavier than I expected. For years I had believed my father's rejection of my legal ambitions had been based on tradition, on outdated beliefs about sons carrying family legacies. But what if the truth was simpler than that? What if he had never wanted me involved in the legal world he had actually built? Later that evening, I prepared a summary report for my supervisor outlining the irregularities in the settlement negotiations. The case, which had begun as a routine contract review, now carried the potential for a deeper investigation. As I was finishing the report, an office clerk appeared in the doorway. "Caroline," she said. "Yes." "There's a message for you." She handed me a printed note. "A witness connected to the case wants to speak with the prosecutor directly." "That's normal," I said. She shook her head. "Not this one." I read the note carefully. The witness had left only one condition. They would speak to no one else. Only me. I looked up from the paper. Did they say why? The clerk shrugged. No explanation. I folded the note slowly and slipped it into the case file. For the first time since the investigation began, a quiet feeling of unease settled over me. Because if someone connected to this case had specifically requested me, then someone out there might already know exactly who I was. The interview room at the courthouse was small, windowless, and quiet enough that every sound seemed louder than usual. I arrived a few minutes early and placed the case file on the table. The witness entered shortly after. He looked like someone who hadn't slept well in days. Mid-40s. Thin. With nervous eyes that kept drifting toward the door as if he expected someone else to walk in. "Thomas Keller?" I asked. He nodded and sat down slowly across from me. For a moment he didn't say anything. His fingers tapped lightly against the table as he studied my face. Then he asked the question I had been expecting. "Are you related to Robert Whitmore?" The room felt suddenly smaller. "Yes," I said calmly. "He's my father." Thomas Keller exhaled slowly, as if confirming something he had suspected for days. "That's why I asked to speak with you," he said. He explained that until 6 months earlier he had worked as a financial analyst for the logistics company involved in the settlement negotiations. His job had been simple: review settlement structures, analyze financial impact, ensure the company's legal strategies minimized losses. At first, he believed everything the company was doing was standard corporate procedure. But eventually he began noticing patterns. Certain settlement offers appeared unusually fast. Negotiations closed before injured workers had completed medical evaluations. Employees accepted payments that were significantly lower than similar cases handled in court. When Keller began asking questions internally, he was told the settlement strategies came from outside consultants, Whitmore strategic legal advisors. I remained silent, letting him continue. Keller reached into his briefcase and placed a small flash drive on the table between us. "I copied these files before I left the company," he said. "Inside the drive," he explained, were internal emails, strategy outlines, and draft settlement agreements that had never been shared outside the executive offices. "These negotiations weren't random," he said quietly. "They were engineered." I plugged the flash drive into my laptop and began opening the files. Email threads filled the screen. Corporate executives discussing settlement strategies, legal advisors recommending timing tactics, and scattered throughout the conversations, a name I already recognized: Daniel Whitmore, my younger brother. Keller leaned forward slightly as I read. "Your brother handled several negotiation strategies personally," he said. I opened one of the email threads. Daniel had written a detailed proposal suggesting that injured workers be offered immediate settlement bonuses if they agreed not to consult outside legal counsel. The message described the approach as a way to accelerate resolution while minimizing unnecessary legal exposure. I read the message twice. There was nothing technically illegal about it, but the strategy relied heavily on pressure. Workers recovering from injuries would be offered quick payments before they had time to fully understand their legal options. It was legal, but it wasn't justice. Keller watched my expression carefully. "You see what I mean?" he said. "Yes." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair before continuing. "There was a meeting last spring," he said. "A strategy session between the company executives and the consulting firm." "Where?" "Atlanta. Private conference room at a hotel." I typed notes as he spoke. "What happened at the meeting?" Keller hesitated. Most of the discussion was about controlling legal exposure before the cases reached court, he said. "Who led the strategy?" For several seconds, Keller didn't answer. Then he spoke quietly. "Your brother." The words settled heavily in the room. I continued typing, keeping my voice steady. "What exactly did he recommend?" Keller described a negotiation plan that involved offering early settlements combined with carefully timed legal warnings that discouraged workers from pursuing lawsuits. The goal was simple: close cases quickly, prevent courtroom litigation, protect the company's reputation. Technically legal, but ethically questionable. After nearly an hour, the interview ended. Keller gathered his briefcase but paused before leaving. "There's something else you should know," he said. "What?" "The company discovered recently that some internal documents are missing." My stomach tightened slightly. Meaning someone may realize the files were copied." He met my eyes directly. "If that happens, they'll start looking for whoever leaked the information." Later that afternoon, I presented the evidence to my supervisor. The quiet corporate dispute we had originally opened was no longer routine. The investigation expanded immediately. Multiple attorneys and consultants connected to the settlement strategies were now potential subjects of inquiry, including Daniel Whitmore, my brother. No one in the office knew about my connection to the consulting firm, and for the moment, I chose not to tell them. That evening, as I left the courthouse, the city lights were already reflecting across the wet pavement outside. I walked toward the train station, exhausted from the day. Halfway down the block, my phone rang. The number on the screen stopped me in my tracks. Charleston, South Carolina. I answered slowly. Hello. For a moment there was only silence on the other end. Then I heard a voice I hadn't spoken to in years. Caroline. My father. His voice sounded exactly the same as it always had. Calm. Controlled. Measured. I heard you've been asking questions about my company, he said. I didn't answer. You should be careful which cases you decide to pursue, he continued quietly. The words were not angry. They were something worse. A warning. Then the line went dead. I stood there for several seconds staring at my phone, because after years of silence, my father had finally called me, and somehow he already knew exactly what I was investigating. I stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse for a long time after my father ended the call. Traffic moved through the intersection. People hurried past without noticing me. The city sounded exactly the same as it always did. But something inside me had shifted. My father had not called me in years. Not when I finished law school. Not when I passed the bar. Not even when my career in the prosecutor's office began gaining attention in legal circles. Yet somehow he had learned about the investigation almost immediately, which meant one thing. The case had already reached his world. That night I returned to my apartment and spread the case documents across the kitchen table. The flash drive from Thomas Keller. Settlement agreements. Corporate emails. The name Whitmore Strategic Legal Advisors appeared repeatedly throughout the records, and Daniel's name appeared almost as often. I read through the files again, slower this time, looking for patterns, looking for anything I might have missed. The deeper I looked, the more uncomfortable the picture became. My brother had not simply assisted in negotiations. He had helped design them. Several email exchanges showed Daniel outlining settlement strategies designed to pressure injured workers into accepting fast agreements. He described them as efficient legal solutions. But the intent behind them was obvious. Avoid lawsuits. Avoid court. Avoid scrutiny. For the first time in my life, I understood something that had never occurred to me before. My father hadn't just underestimated me. He had trusted the wrong child. The next morning, our investigation team met in a conference room at the prosecutor's office. My supervisor reviewed the new evidence carefully. If these emails are accurate, he said, this consulting firm may have crossed into legal manipulation. Another attorney shook his head. The tactics are aggressive, but they're still technically legal. That depends. My supervisor replied, if they intentionally pressured victims before full medical assessments, the settlements could be challenged. The room fell quiet. Which means we need stronger evidence, someone added. I flipped through the documents again. One message in particular had caught my attention the night before. An internal email referencing a private strategy meeting held in Atlanta. The meeting had taken place shortly before several of the disputed settlements were finalized. According to the message, corporate executives met with representatives from Whitmore Strategic Legal Advisors to finalize their negotiation approach. I pointed to the email on the screen. This meeting might be important, I said. Why? The negotiation strategies appeared to have changed immediately afterward. My supervisor nodded slowly. Who attended the meeting? I read the names listed in the message. Corporate representatives, senior consultants, and a final name written only as initials. R. The room was quiet as everyone considered the possibilities. No one in the room knew what those initials meant to me. But I knew exactly who they represented. Robert Whitmore. My father. That evening I met Marcus Hale for dinner at a quiet restaurant near the courthouse. Marcus had been the one who gave me my first chance in the legal world. He had watched my career develop from the very beginning. When I explained the situation to him, he listened without interrupting. So your father's firm may be directly connected to the strategy meeting, he said finally. Yes. And your brother handled several of the negotiations afterward? Yes. Marcus leaned back in his chair. If this investigation continues, he said carefully, your family name may end up appearing in court records. I nodded. I know. He studied me for a moment. Then I'll ask you the question no one else in your office can ask. What's that? Are you prepared for where this might lead? I understood exactly what he meant. If the investigation moved forward, the legal world might soon learn that the Whitmore Consulting Network had played a role in manipulating settlement negotiations, and I would be the prosecutor who uncovered it. I didn't start this investigation because of my family, I said quietly. Marcus nodded. But you might finish it because of them. For several days after that conversation, I considered stepping away from the case. No one in my office knew about the connection. I could easily request reassignment. But every time I considered it, the same thought returned. Justice didn't become optional just because it was uncomfortable. So I made my decision. I stayed. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. The Illinois Judicial Commission announced that a seat had opened on the state bench. Several senior attorneys in the prosecutor's office began discussing possible candidates. Late one afternoon, Marcus walked into my office holding a folder. What's that? I asked. A nomination form. For who? For you? I laughed immediately. Marcus, I'm too young for a judicial appointment. Not necessarily, he said. He placed the folder on my desk. You've built a strong record here. Strong enough that people are starting to notice. I stared at the form for a long time before signing it. The interview with the Judicial Selection Committee took place weeks later in a quiet government building. 3 judges and 2 legal advisors sat across the table asking questions about my career, my legal philosophy, and my approach to justice. Near the end of the interview, one of the judges leaned forward slightly. How would you handle a case involving powerful legal networks with strong political connections? He asked. I didn't hesitate. No one stands above the law, I said. Not even the people who raised me. The interview ended shortly afterward. Several weeks passed without any news. Then one evening I returned home to find an official envelope waiting in my mailbox. I carried it upstairs and sat at the kitchen table before opening it. For several seconds I simply stared at the letter inside. Then I read the first line again to make sure I understood it correctly. I had been officially appointed to serve as a judge on the Illinois State Bench. For a long moment I sat there in silence, and the only thought that crossed my mind was this. If my father ever discovered the truth, the words he once used to dismiss me would sound very different now. The dean's voice carried clearly across the auditorium. Your Honor, I didn't realize you were here. For a moment, no one moved. The words seemed to float above the crowd like something unexpected and fragile. Then the silence broke. Hundreds of people turned in their seats at the same time, searching for the person the dean had just addressed. I slowly stood from the back row. I wasn't trying to make a scene. I simply stood because remaining seated would have been impossible now. The dean nodded politely in my direction, confirming what everyone in the room had just heard. Whispers spread through the audience like a sudden wind. Did he say, Your Honor? Who is she? Is she a judge? Near the front of the auditorium. My father turned around. Robert Whitmore had always carried himself with a quiet authority. In every room he entered, he was usually the one people watched. But now he was the one staring. His eyes moved across the rows until they landed on me. For several seconds he didn't react. It was as if his mind refused to process what he was seeing. The daughter he had once dismissed was standing in the back row of a law school graduation ceremony while the dean addressed her as a judge. I could almost see the memory forming behind his eyes. The dinner table. The sentence he had spoken so confidently. The one who will become a lawyer in this family is him, not you. On stage, the dean continued speaking. We are honored tonight to have one of our state judges visiting us this evening, he said warmly. Her work in the Illinois court system has earned the respect of many in the legal community. Polite applause began spreading through the room. At first it was hesitant. Then it grew louder as more people joined in. I acknowledged the dean with a small nod before sitting down again. The applause eventually faded as the ceremony resumed. But the atmosphere in the room had changed. People continued glancing toward the back rows. Whispers traveled quietly between families. And near the front, my father remained completely still. Daniel stood on the stage with the other graduates, still holding his diploma. He had been smiling moments earlier. Now the smile was gone. When his eyes met mine across the auditorium, I saw something unexpected in his expression. Not anger, not jealousy, something closer to fear. Because Daniel understood something that most of the people in the room did not. He knew about the investigation. He knew the prosecutor who had uncovered the documents connected to Whitmore's strategic legal advisors. And now he knew that prosecutor had already become a judge. The rest of the ceremony passed quickly. Graduates lined up for photographs. Families gathered near the stage. Laughter and celebration slowly replaced the tension that had filled the room. I waited near the exit while people moved toward the front of the auditorium. Eventually, Daniel approached me. He looked different up close. Not physically, but the confidence he had always carried seemed quieter now. "You came?" he said. "Yes." He glanced toward the stage where our father was still speaking with a group of professors. "I didn't expect to see you here," Daniel said. "I know." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled slowly. "I've heard rumors about an investigation," he said carefully. I said nothing. "They said a prosecutor in Chicago uncovered the evidence," he continued. Our eyes met. "You knew it was me," I said. He nodded once. "I suspected." His voice carried something I had never heard before. Uncertainty. "You could have destroyed everything," he said quietly. "I didn't start the investigation because of you," I replied. "But you didn't stop it either." "No." Daniel looked down at the diploma in his hands. "For years I believed what Dad always said," he admitted. "What was that?" "That I was the one meant for the law." Before I could respond, another voice spoke behind us. "Caroline." I turned. My father was standing a few feet away. Up close. The change in him was obvious. Robert Whitmore had always looked completely certain of himself. Tonight, that certainty was gone. For several seconds, he simply looked at me. Then he asked a question that sounded almost quiet. "When did this happen?" I understood what he meant. "When did you become a judge?" "It happened slowly," I said. "After I left Charleston." His eyes searched my face as if trying to reconstruct years of time he had ignored. "You never told us," he said. "You never asked." The words were not spoken with anger, just with honesty. My father looked down briefly before speaking again. "I didn't think you wanted to follow this path. I remembered the sentence from the dinner table all those years ago. The one who'll become a lawyer in this family is him, not you." "You told me the law wasn't for me," I said. For the first time in my life, Robert Whitmore had no response. He simply nodded once. Around us, families continued celebrating. Cameras flashed. Graduates laughed and hugged their parents. But in that moment, the three of us stood quietly in the middle of the crowd. Because the balance inside our family had changed. The daughter who had once been dismissed as incapable of entering the legal world had returned as something my father never expected. And the silence on his face said more than any apology ever could. For a few seconds after my father asked that question, none of us spoke. Around us, the graduation ceremony was dissolving into celebration. Families crowded the stage. Cameras flashed, and graduates laughed as they hugged one another. But the small circle between my father, my brother, and me felt strangely quiet. My father studied my face as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had been sitting in front of him for years. "When did this happen?" he asked again, more softly this time. I understood the real meaning behind the question. Not the date of my appointment. The moment his assumptions had stopped being true. "It didn't happen all at once," I said. His eyebrows tightened slightly. "I left Charleston," I continued. "I worked during the day. I studied at night. I went to law school in Chicago." Daniel looked up sharply. "You went to law school?" he asked. "Yes," Neither of them spoke for several seconds. "You never told us," Daniel said finally. I held his gaze calmly. "You never asked." The words weren't meant to be cruel. They were simply the truth. My father looked down at the floor briefly before meeting my eyes again. "You could have come home," he said. "I did come home," I replied quietly. His expression shifted with confusion. "You just didn't notice," I said. The three of us stood there while the noise of the crowd flowed around us like water. For most of my life, my father had filled every room with his certainty. He had always known what his children were supposed to become. He had always known which path was right. But now he was looking at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. "You're a judge," he said slowly. "Yes." The word seemed to settle between us. My father glanced briefly toward Daniel, then back at me. "I told people for years that Daniel would carry the Whitmore name in the law," he said. Daniel shifted slightly beside him. "Maybe you still can?" I said calmly. My father shook his head. "No," he said. For a moment he seemed almost amused by the irony. I suppose I was wrong about more than one thing. That was as close to an apology as Robert Whitmore had ever given anyone. Daniel looked at me again. "I read some of the reports about the investigation," he said quietly. "I figured you might. You were the one who started it. I followed the evidence." He nodded slowly. "I know." For a few seconds he stared down at the diploma still clutched in his hands. "I thought Dad was right about everything," he admitted. I didn't respond. "I thought I was supposed to be the successful one," he continued. "The one who proved the family name meant something." "You still can?" I repeated. Daniel shook his head. "That's not the point anymore." He looked up again. "The point is, you did it without any of the things I had." I understood what he meant. Connections. Money. Expectations built in advance. Everything my father had prepared for him. "I didn't do it alone," I said. My mind briefly returned to a small bedroom in Charleston, to a worn legal reference book placed quietly on my desk, to a letter slipped inside an envelope. My grandmother Eleanor had believed in me long before anyone else had. My father noticed the slight smile on my face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "My grandmother?" I said. For a moment his expression softened. "She always did think you were stubborn," he said. "She called it determination." My father let out a quiet breath. Then he looked around the auditorium filled with celebrating families. "You know," he said slowly, "I spent most of my life believing the law was about legacy. What do you believe now?" I asked. He looked directly at me. "Maybe it's about character?" The sentence hung in the air for a moment before Daniel let out a small laugh. "Dad, if the legal world ever hears you say that, they'll think someone replaced you." My father almost smiled. For the first time in the conversation, the tension eased. But the past had not disappeared. And it didn't need to, because something more important had already changed. The balance between us. I had spent years believing this moment would feel like revenge. I thought standing in front of my father as a judge would feel like victory. But as I looked at him standing there in the middle of the crowded auditorium, I realized something surprising. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you finally stop carrying someone else's doubt. Because the truth is this: the most powerful revenge isn't humiliating the people who underestimated you. It's becoming the person they said you could never be. Eventually, the crowd began moving toward the exits. Graduates gathered with their families outside the building, laughing under the evening lights. My father walked a few steps beside me as we left the auditorium. Before we reached the doors, he stopped. "Caroline," he said. I turned back. "I suppose I should start introducing you differently now." "How's that?" He paused for a moment. Then he said the words slowly, as if testing them. "My daughter, the judge." For the first time in my life, hearing those words didn't feel like something I had fought to earn. They simply felt true. And if you've ever had someone in your life tell you that you weren't capable of something, that you didn't belong somewhere, that you would never become the person you dreamed of becoming, I'd really like to hear your story. Tell me in the comments what someone once said you could never do, and whether you proved them wrong. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the loudest voices of doubt come from the people closest to us. But they don't get to decide the ending of our story. If you enjoy real stories about family drama, justice, and people quietly reclaiming their dignity after betrayal, stay here with the channel. There are many more stories like this waiting to be told. And if this one meant something to you, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one.